All right, so we're going to move on to our next panel here, which is a panel about, in a lot of ways, kind of the dessert or the main course, I guess. The dessert will come later, but the main course really about what do we actually do from a policy perspective, and what are the kinds of steps that Congress, the administration, states, and other governmental actors need to be taking. So we have a great moderator for this, Bryan Walsh, who covers energy and environment issues for Time magazine. Before coming, he worked to New York, where he's based. He worked for Time in Hong Kong and Tokyo, and besides developing an appreciation for small apartments, which I actually think he probably develops and appreciates in New York, where you have to have that. He focused on the energy transformation that's going on in developing Asia, and his ecocentric blog also covers green topics from tree hugging to technology to climate science to Capitol Hill. So with that, Bryan.
Thanks very much.
I would just also add, remember, if you want to do questions, just write them down as we go on and hold them up.
Okay. Our last two moderators, of course, we're standing, but I think this is about a 75-minute panel, so I'm going to sit for now, and maybe if the spirit moves me, I'll stand up later. We've had a great discussion so far talking about the different policies of energy innovation. We heard from the venture capital community, the people who are really that are really driving the engine of risk. Now we're going to be speaking about how do we actually create public policies that can actually effectively drive energy innovation forward. How do we get down to the nuts and bolts of creating that regime, because we know we don't have the technology that we need yet to deal with the energy and climate challenge, but we also clearly don't have the innovation policy we need to get there either. I was actually I was at the UN Cancun meeting last week, which is not as cool as being at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, but the weather was a lot better. And you saw, there's this sense there, you get a lot of talk about technology transfer, you get a lot of talk obviously about future commitments for emission cuts, things like that. But technology, as a sense, innovation is not something that's ever really discussed there. And this is the international body that's still the biggest one when it comes, supposedly at least, to dealing with climate and, in a certain sense, energy policy, and it's really not there. So we need that to change, and that's what we'll be talking about at our panel here. And we are very fortunate to have an excellent panel with us. Starting at my right, we have William Bonvillian, who is the director of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Washington, D.C. office, where he works to support MIT's strong and historic relations with federal R&D agencies and its role on national science policy. Before that, he served for 17 years as the legislative director and chief counsel to Senator Joseph Lieberman. To his right, we have Armond Cohen, who's the co-founder and executive director of the Clean Air Task Force, which is a nonprofit dedicated to reducing atmospheric pollution and commercializing and innovating clean energy technology. Right now, a lot of their work focuses on building CCS, on commercial scale demonstration of CCS, and enabling those technologies not just in the U.S. but also in China and India. To his right, we have Thomas Kerr, who is a senior energy analyst at the International Energy Agency in Paris. He manages the IEA Energy Technology Roadmaps project, which is developing a series of global roadmaps to accelerate the most important low-carbon energy technologies that we need to address climate change. Before that, he was the chief of energy supply and industry branch at the U.S. EPA in Washington, D.C. To his right, we have Sasha Mackler, who's the research director for the National Commission on Energy Policy. He joined the commission in 2002 after spending several years at the EPA's Clean Air Markets Division, and he now conducts work on the economic, technological, and environmental aspects of energy production and consumption. And lastly, at the end there, we have Mark Muro, who is a fellow and director of policy at the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings, where he manages the public policy analysis and leads key public policy research projects. Before that, he was a senior policy analyst at the Morrison Institute for Public Policy at Arizona State, and he's also been a journalist, so he's a recovering journalist, staff writer for the Boston Globe, and an editorial writer for the Arizona Daily Star. I'm going to start with Bill to my right, asking a question. I'm going to ask each person a question, sort of open it up, and then we're going to go to a bit more of a conversation. We've had a lot of talk so far about our need, clearly, for better energy innovation. You have written the book on structuring an energy technology revolution, which is called Structuring an Energy Technology Revolution. Lead us through what you would describe as a more ideal system for actually getting to the challenges that we need to, sort of fixing some of the failures we have in our system now.
Thanks, Bryan. As we all, recognize, innovating in a very complex, very much established sector like energy is a different proposition than what we're used to. Typically, the U.S. innovates and opens kind of new territory. I mean, that's kind of what we did in IT. That's what we did in biotech. We don't go back and bring innovation to a very complex established sector. We just kind of move on. It's a very American kind of thing. But with a complex established sector, you've got to think not only about the technology push side, the new innovations, but you've got to also think about the technology pull, the demand pull, the pricing side as well. And getting that balance right makes energy a particularly complicated dimension for us because we're not used to dealing with those kind of double variables on the innovation policy side. But for 15 years we thought we would deal with this issue through cap and trade. I mean, that has been the dominant policy thinking around climate and energy for a very long period of time. We never really quite developed, what's the fallback plan? What's plan B? And now we're having to confront that. Now, interestingly, one of the problems with cap and trade was that, it really dealt with the demand, the technology pull, the price, the demand side, and those are important factors in an established sector. It didn't really focus on the innovation system itself. So I would argue that we've got an opportunity, given the fact that our assumed strategy on demand on the pull side is on hold for probably a significant period of time. There is an opportunity to really look hard at the innovation system, and which we haven't really fully addressed previously. Now, the problem with energy technology, as many technologies, is that the new entrant technologies always cost more. It always takes time to drive down that historic price curve when new entrant technologies come online. So we're going to have to do some different things than we typically do when we're innovating in an open field, when we're dealing with a complex established sector, because the new entrant technologies in IT could command a high price. They could command a premium price because they introduce new functionality. Well, in energy, typically the first generation of technologies is not going to be all that different from established technologies, right? An electric car or a hybrid vehicle is not all that different from an internal combustion vehicle and so on. So we've got this big problem that our first gen of new energy technologies, by and large, with some exceptions, is not going to introduce a lot of new functionality. So we've got a really serious problem on that front, and yet we have an R&D system that still thinks just do the research, just do the development, and then the marketplace will handle this. And I would argue that we're going to have to go to a much more integrated innovation systems kind of approach and look at, for sure, the research and for sure the development, but also look at a public-private set of roles on the prototyping and the demonstration and the test beds and the initial markets, right? So that's the kind of system that the Department of Defense has been running for years, right? And there's probably a lot of lessons to take from DOD, as some of this was mentioned by Jeff Markesy this morning. So that, I think, taking that systems approach, and then secondly, thinking about looking at technologies that can introduce some new functionality, right? So let's see if there's some of those first generation technologies that could do new functionality. But secondly, look at R&D as a more extended process. Don't just worry about getting the research done. Think about an R&D process that also thinks about driving that initial price down. So there's alterations we can make in our R&D strategy. Now, in the end, though, we're still going to have to deal with price, right? Just the historic problem of new entering technologies costing more is something we're going to have to wrestle with in energy. And we've got a bunch of historic command and control regulatory tools that are out there. We can certainly use some of those. But if cap and trade is off the table for an indefinite period of time, not only will we have to rethink our innovation strategy, I think in a very systems kind of way, but we're going to have to rethink, what is our pricing strategy going to be too.
Just a quick follow-up. I mean, does that mean that in the absence of cap and trade, in the absence of a carbon price that's high enough to not just raise revenue, which is what I think we've heard suggested in the past, but actually change behavior, will this system not work? I mean, will these new technologies simply they don't offer the functionality you'll be getting in other fields?
Well, again, we've got a 40-year process here, and not everything has to happen at once, right? There's a lot of work that can be done on the innovation side of things, particularly if you took this systems approach to the innovation side, which we haven't, frankly, been doing, right? So getting the innovations right becomes an enabler on the pricing side. In other words, if you began introducing technologies that were widely accepted as plausible and within range of price, you'd go a long way to making the pricing side much more acceptable. So, I think there's a lot of progress that can be made as we look at the technology push side and then continue to ponder the technology pull side.
I think we'll come back to the push and pull side, but I wanted to ask Sasha to talk a little bit about, we heard obviously from the VC side, but I know in terms of the private sector, energy as an industry, not only does government not spend a whole lot on R&D energy, but neither does private industry as well. I mean, you can compare it to pharmaceuticals, you compare it to high tech, it's just apparently a tiny part of their revenue. So what role or what room for enhanced innovation on energy could the private sector be taking? I mean, what else could they be doing beyond now? I mean, keeping in mind, of course, much like the federal government, they're going to be operating under some financial constraints, but surely what else could they be doing to play their part in this energy ecosystem?
Sure. And I think, of course, we all agree that the private sector can and must be mobilized to do a whole lot more than they're doing today in the energy space. And in fact, if they don't, we're simply not going to solve the great energy challenges of our time. And that being said, how can we help make this happen? And as you might know, I helped put together this collection of a small collection of business leaders called the American Energy Innovation Council, led by Bill Gates, Jeff Immelt from GE, John Doerr from venture capital firm, and a few others. And the whole point of that exercise was to try to get some of their thinking on how they manage innovation in the private sector and inject that into how we might shape our public policies in this space. And one of the key insights that came out of that work that I think is just worth highlighting here, I'm sure you've heard it already today at some point, is the fact that the energy system, the energy sector is made up of such a diverse set of actors, of technologies, of components, that it's a very difficult thing to try to manage in some sense, particularly from the public policy perspective. And the overarching principle that we should really keep in mind is that we need to point all the actors and have all the incentives in the same direction. And that's really something we don't have today. We don't have a coordinated sort of strategic energy policy that sort of takes us over the long term. And that's one thing that will really drive, I think, where we need to go. And as what makes our current energy system different from the sectors that you highlighted, I think there's three things that we need to always keep in mind. And one is that it's highly regulated. If you look at the utility system, it's just a completely different kind of marketplace than we have in other areas. The second thing is that the energy products are commodity products. And that just makes it also fundamentally different from other areas. And finally, that all energy activities are really shaped by public policy because of its impact on land use, on air quality, on things like that. And so these are things that make energy different. And so that's just useful to keep in mind. But as John Doerr likes to say, clean energy is the mother of all markets. And so if we get these incentives set right, the private sector will move in. So I think there's no doubt about that, but it's really what is the overarching policy framework. And there's a few things that I'll just put out there on the innovation side of things that we can return to. One is that we need to really take a little bit more time and more money and do a better job of filling the cupboards with ideas. And that's, how we need to invest more in technology. That's just a basic thing that we're not doing enough of today. And the other thing that we should think about is how do we get that coherent long-term strategy in place, because in the end, nothing destroys markets, nothing destroys incentives for the private sector to participate, and uncertainty or volatility. And so having some kind of coherent long-term plan, I think, is really something we need to strive for. And I think a cap-and-trade policy, a lot has been, as Bill pointed out, and I'm sure others also, a lot has been sort of hung on that hook as, that's really going to be our climate policy. That would have done a lot. It would have done everything that we needed for a variety of reasons that we can talk about. But, that would have helped create some of the markets that we really need. But there's other ways to create those markets too. And well, I'll stop there.
We'll definitely want to come back to the American Energy Innovation Council, because I'm curious. Both cap and trade had its group of big economic luminaries, and obviously they couldn't quite push that over the edge. I'm wondering if Bill Gates and the kind of people who are in that council can push that over the edge when it comes to that funding for energy research. But next we'll go to Mark, and last night at dinner, afterwards we started playing this climate counterfactual game where you think, well, what would happen if this happened, or if cap and trade had passed, or if this? Well, let's say we actually do have this sort of research money. I know that you, Mark, have done a lot of work on how we can actually get better bang for the buck when it comes to that spending, in terms of looking at how we can create regional hubs, clusters of R&D. How, if we have that money, how would a system that has those sort of hubs actually work better, get these innovations out faster?
Great, Bryan. It's great. This is a great energy hub today, right here. This is a great dense network. My point all along. First, complete truism at this point. I think everybody in this room agrees. The magnitude is grossly inadequate. That's no longer controversial, thanks to incredible work by an awful lot of people in this room. My focus has been on the need for institutional experimentation, and where one might conclude also, or might include regions as part of an institution in a way. They are an organizational arrangement, and as Dr. Bonvillian is saying, what we're doing is not working. Even if we got the number to the kind of order of magnitude in multiplication we need, I think we would still be falling short. So, our angle, and I work with the Metropolitan Policy Program, and we're obsessed with place, space, environment for activities, and, so we work with institutional thinking as well. Highly influenced by Rob Atkinson's work, and Greg Tassi at NIST's discussion of the black box. We've had a simplistic view of what innovation is and how it works. After 50 years of neoclassical domination, we think you just pour R&D in the top, and out come iPhones and brilliant, game-changing technology innovations in the energy space. So, we think that's not enough. It's misleading. It leaves out real-life commercialization as it occurs. All of the variables around the pathway to scaling, fast-moving dynamics, financial issues, complications, business plan problems and flaws, information spillovers on the upside, and breakdowns, institutional flaws, coordination and communication problems, and gains. So, given that, how do we deal with that? The current system has been insular, segmented, divorced from the private marketplace, and divorced from other communities in general. So essentially siloed. We think we need engagement, partnership, mashups, some of the kind of things that Steve Johnson talks about that cities perform as one thing, but there are buildings perform them too. So, we've talked about, regional energy discovery innovation institutes, an idea that had some influence, I think, on the emerging hubs notion, which we think is quite narrow. The idea is to push together different communities, different sectors, different intellectual disciplines. So, and we think so. In that sense, universities, laboratories, and corporations clearly need to have collisions around directed attacks on tough problems, but we think it should be even broader. We think any kind of hub ought to be clearly embedded in a region, ought to have, at least some of them, strong connections to the entrepreneurs, other research institutions, investors, trade associations, governments, and so on in place. So I want to plant a flag for what place-based innovation can bring to the table. It's one of the most complicated, it's one of the ways to get complication and connection and partnership into this.
So would that mean Detroit gets cars, the Southwest gets solar? I mean, how would you actually sort of dividing that up, or what region might be best for different areas?
Clearly, a subset of these ought to be regional. I mean, first, we think the pie ought to be out larger. We think there ought to be 30 or 40 of these kind of hubs of different sorts. Some of them, should have a strong regional cast where there is documented expertise of different kinds, but it might be a little broader definition away from simply, science-based expertise. Clearly there are, Seattle might become a region-based hub for energy efficiency export activities and best in class. So I think we just need to look for a few other models along with somewhat narrowly defined hubs as they exist now.
So to Armond, if you've read James Fallow's cover story in the most recent Atlantic, then you're on coal in China, then you're a little bit familiar with his group's work. You've been doing a lot. I'm looking at CCS and carbon capture sequestration for coal, and within that story it seemed, viewing China, because it's industrializing so rapidly, building so many plants, which is usually seen as a bad thing. It's usually seen as, we get that stat every day, it seems, China's building 2 to 3 coal plants a week, and that's like the death sentence for the human race. But you're looking at it a bit in a different way, which is this is the way you can actually, develop better technologies very quickly. But at the same time, we just heard in the last panel some doubts about CCS. I mean, unlike, we talked about energy not adding functionality, I mean, CCS really, if you don't care about carbon, you would think if you don't put a price on carbon, how do you ever make CCS work? So, I mean, just given the scarcity of funds we all have in the energy development basket, why have you chosen to put a lot of energy into this?
Right. Well, as Willie Sutton said, you go and rob banks because that's where the money is. You deal with the fossil part of the system because that's where the CO2 is. And I really want to echo a point that Bill made in the last panel, which is if you don't deal with the fossil part of the system, and I want to address gas as well as coal, because everyone picks on coal, but gas is a rising share of global electricity supply as well, you don't have a solution to the carbon problem. I have to take one step back and offer a fact which I don't think is well recognized in the climate debate. There is this impression out there that the climate system is a little bit like a machine that you can regulate with a dial. And if we somehow ratchet back on CO2 over 50 years, in 20 or 30 years, the system will cleanse itself. Well, that's not how it works, actually. 1,000 years after we put a molecule up in the atmosphere, half of the amount we put up is there 1,000 years later. So it's a very slow decay, which means that if you're talking about any of these targets, 2, 3, 4 degrees, you pick your number, the only safe level is 0. The bathtub is full of carbon. We're getting there very rapidly. So you really need to take your energy system down to 0. Now, that's an important fact, because what that means is you need to deal with the whole banana. You can't just chip away at the edges or take a century to kind of to do that. Now, why does that take you to fossil? Well, the reality is right now we can talk as much as we want about wind or solar efficiency, but 70% of the planet's electricity is coming from coal and gas. That is not going to change appreciably over the next several decades, I would venture. China just built an entire coal fleet in 5 years, which is the size of the U.S. coal fleet, which took us 100 years to build. Those plants are less than 5 years old. They're not going to be bulldozed anytime soon. So, as Tom just noted before the panel, we hear a lot about solar and wind, but the fastest growing global energy source by far in absolute amounts is coal. So those are the unfortunate and very ugly facts of life. And of course, we have unconventional gas coming in on top of that and displacing some coal, to be sure, but still very carbon rich. So that takes you to CCS. As I said, solar, wind, efficiency have their place. I mean, California has just run a 25-year experiment on efficiency, and Stanford University recently said it's been great. They've chopped about 10% off otherwise prevailing demand, but 10% is not 100 and it's not 30. Solar and wind have, as many of you know in this audience, some real challenges in terms of providing baseload power, intermittency. They're all great things to do, but in terms of the baseload 24/7 backbone of the world electricity system, it's pretty much fossil and nukes at this point in terms of what we really have, and hydro arguably at least within some time span. So that's why we're working on CCS. There are definitely technical challenges. I would point out, though, that, for example, we're already injecting as much wastewater each year in Florida by tonnage as all CO2 coming out of power plants in the U.S. So these are big engineering challenges, but they aren't historically unprecedented engineering challenges. On the cost side, I would say we do have some reason for optimism. I have enough gray hairs on my head to remember in the acid rain debates and the smog debates when utilities were saying, these scrubbers won't work, or they'll cost $2,000, $3,000 a kilowatt. Well, they work. And in fact, they cost something like $500 a kilowatt, to run. It costs something, but we did it. Natural gas combined cycle, a technology that wasn't there 30 years ago, is now supplying 20% of national electricity. An interesting game changer, potentially, we go to this issue of cost, underground coal gasification, which is actually an old technology. It's an in-situ gasification in the seam, deep seam, something that Russia started doing 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and then just stopped, is something that's being seriously looked at in the U.S., China, and India. It pencils out pretty inexpensively, and in fact, the first cut is you could do zero carbon looping of CO2 back into the cavity and get your electricity for the same cost as building a dirty new coal plant. So in other words, it actually you get the zero carbon that's competitive with coal. So could that be? Those are the kinds of game changers. Last comment before I want to make a comment about China is that it really is all about how much. The theme of the day is how much do we take this problem seriously, and I think if we can take problems seriously, we're probably not limited. Anecdote, we had a bunch of scientists sitting around the table and technologists who were thinking about advanced, much cheaper post-combustion capture of carbon platforms. Right now we have a pretty clunky one aiming scrubbing, but they're talking about nanotech versions of this and atomic order of materials. And we were in a workshop and I said, okay, so how quickly can you do this if you were given the money? And they said, well, it's going to take 30 years. And I said, no, what if you had essentially an unlimited budget and they told you had to do it in 5? And the response of all the scientists was, well, gee, no one ever asked us that question before. And I think this goes kind of to the grand challenge idea that Marty laid out earlier, which is there are probably 10 really grand challenges. And I would submit a much better, more efficient post-combustion capture of carbon is one of those challenges. I don't think that should be beyond our reach. By the way, the number they needed was $5 billion a year for everything, not just post-combustion, but everything else. That's the size of the wind production tax credit right now. I mean, that's not out of range of what our political system has shown itself capable of doing. So I think it's doable. I think we have to put our minds to it. If we don't do it, let's not kid ourselves. We're not going to solve this problem. The last thing on China I'll just say, and the reason we're over there, is that we see that as a place where to demo advanced technology. They're growing, we're not. They need the power, they can afford, they're liquid. They have our money, which they lent to us and we gave back to them. So there's a lot of money sloshing around the system. One company we're dealing with in China, one company has a $20 billion a $20 billion R&D or alternative energy budget to develop a business unit over 4 years. That's Steve Chu's entire budget, and this is one company in China. So again, you go where the money is, but also where the demand is, because when you're growing, you can afford to experiment. You have to build the stuff anyway. In this country, we're declining. So the other thing I'll say about China is just, interestingly, there is a real norm change going on there. I don't think they're going to start building all their coal plants with carbon capture and storage, but they're sure as heck figuring out how to do it in case they have to. And I think that that's part of the evolution where if you went there 5 years ago, there weren't many scrubbers on coal plants, and the ones that were on weren't being operated. Now, 72% of the coal plants that are operating have scrubbers, and they are being operated. And that's a lot of change in 5 years. So I think, I think it's kind of mission impossible if you don't deal with the fossil. And again, it's gas as well as coal. People are signaling out coal, but you're not going to get to zero by building a lot of shale gas fired power plants and having that be your energy policy, which is essentially what our energy policy is right now.
One quick follow-up. I mean, to take that $20 billion that one Chinese company has, I mean, you know China. They have air pollution issues that I'm sure are a much higher public priority right now than climate change. I mean, is that money going to CCS? And again, we're going to come back to this again and again, I think, but in the absence of a carbon price or something along those lines, something that gives a financial penalty for CO2, why would they be focusing on CCS?
Well, the first answer is I think they're looking at, yes, they are, some of that money will be targeted to CCS. Part of it will be targeted to underground coal gasification because they think that's a potential game changer that costs zero, where there's a zero premium for zero carbon coal. But that said, Bryan, it's a great question. How much of that will they eventually deploy? And again, I think it's all about norms. Again, there was no consensus in that society 10 years ago to reduce sulfur, but now there is. In the United States, one policy we're pushing, now the cap and trade seems to be on the shelf for the time being, is a carbon performance standard for coal units to force the technology and create the market. We did it for sulfur, we did it for NOx. We can do it for CO2, and by God, if you do the R&D, we'll figure out how to do it. And 15 years from now, we'll be laughing and saying, remember when they said you couldn't do this? It's going to be, I think there's a good chance. So I think I would argue that you're right you do need a norm. There needs to be some social norm, whether that's a performance standard or, I would argue in China, maybe much more of just a societal change that says, you just got to deal with climate, and you're not a world-class country, playing at the level you should be if you have a system that's essentially, which by 2030 otherwise is going to be the dominant CO2 source on the planet by far.
Well, if you're not a world-class country, unless you're dealing with climate, that doesn't say a lot of really good things about us.
Well, I would say so. I mean, I think the danger here, of course, as has been mentioned, is these collaborations we're doing between China and U.S. companies, I think, are great. I think the scary thing is that the Chinese, this one company, is scouring all over the world, just like China's scouring for rare earths and metals. They're scouring up companies and technologies, too. So I think if we don't get it, I really don't buy into the complete competition part of the story. I think there's a lot of ground for cooperation, but I think if we don't, to some extent, ride in China's slipstream, we're going to get run over.
Good. Tom, while we're still sort of talking about international issues, we hear a lot about the numbers in terms of the way China and especially other Asian countries are lapping us when it comes to the money they're focusing on this issue. But when you're actually looking at what they're doing, are there case studies, are there lessons, development plans, anything like that we can take and actually use here in the U.S. that's happening overseas?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad I was invited today because I've worked in Washington for many years before being in Paris, and there's just very much a tendency here to look inward and look only at what the U.S. is doing. And I think what we really can see, and one thing we do at IEA a lot, is we develop these long-term scenarios and strategies for how do you achieve climate goals. And we're getting more, they're very well received, but then the question we're getting much more these days is, okay, how do I actually do this? What do I do in the next 5 years? And so we are doing these sort of roadmaps you mentioned that I'm doing. But as well, we started a new project on what is best practice technology policy. what are countries doing in this space in terms of innovation policy and technology development. So we've started a process by which we're actually visiting about 15 different countries around the world, sitting down with their people that are running their technology programs and interviewing them and finding out what's working and what isn't, and trying to document some of these case studies. And so I think if I had to boil it down to 3 key aspects, first is the value of focus. The countries that are doing this well have looked very hard at what resources they have, what skills they have, and they've actually said we only can do wind or biofuels. We're not going to do fuel cells or CCS. We're going to pick a few and try to do very well with those. Government needs to lead by far. We've heard that a lot today. But the ones that actually are successful, they have a very good, comprehensive, long-term strategy for their innovation to happen. They involve the private sector in developing that strategy very collaboratively, and they've also invested. It is more of a, I guess you might call it a centralized planning, where they've decided that we need to build infrastructure for this stuff. We need to provide. We talked about push and pull. We can't just fund R&D for technologies. We have to pull it into the market as well and be smart about how we do that, and then hopefully fade out those pull mechanisms as the technology becomes cost competitive. And then finally, they give a prominent role to the private sector in developing the strategy, in implementing the strategy. Public-private partnerships are really strong. And so a couple examples I'll give. I'm only halfway through my world tour here, so we've been up mostly in Europe. But the Nordic countries are amazing in terms of what they've been able to accomplish. You look at Sweden and nuclear and biomass. You look at Norway, hydropower and CCS now. You look at Finland and bioenergy just generally, and Denmark and wind. All of these countries 20 years ago weren't anywhere in these technologies, but with the oil crisis came along. A good example was Denmark. They were a big oil importer, used a lot of coal for power generation. They started to say, we don't want to do this anymore, and the government passed some policies, and they were very much, you will do this. We will have feed-in tariffs. We will have planning of where the heat is for CHP, what cities would do district heating, things like that. And I have a great map that if I know we could have had a slide, I would have sent a slide for this, where you see in Denmark in 1978 with its power plants, there's like 12 big red dots. And then they show you, and today it's gone like Denmark's gotten the measles. You see a bunch of very small red dots, and they've gone to decentralized generation from this central power, and I think they've almost eliminated coal from their power sector, otherwise maybe in CHP, and they've almost reduced their oil dependency. So that's a success story, and we hear we need leadership or vision. I think this is a small scale, and a lot of people always say, oh, we can't do what those countries have done, but I think, why not? These people, they decided they wanted to do it, and I think it's for many different reasons, but we have some success stories that we can copy, and I think that these countries are showing a lot of interesting examples that could be just blown up in a larger scale here in the U.S.
We have a lot of different subjects we sort of have in the air we can talk about here. But Bill, I wanted to ask you one thing, going through your book. The energy system we have now, this came up before, is a political animal. I mean, we can see this every time, at the end of the year, when we start seeing different industries mobilizing to get their credits passed. We actually saw it, I believe that Section 1603 just passed today, I think, actually. You have different districts. You obviously, the ethanol lobby in the Midwest, its political power gives its perhaps outsized influence on the system. How much are we held back by not having what would be closer to a technology-neutral sort of system? And is that even possible, do you think? I mean, if that were possible, how much would that possibly help us?
Well, it's obviously not the only part of the puzzle, but I think it is a significant part. I mean, traditionally we write energy bills with a title for each technology, and the support that goes to each technology depends upon its political power, right? That's the way we do energy bills. And that's problematic unless we think that, corn-based ethanol is the perfect answer, right? Because that always comes out on the top of the pile, at least historically, in the way in which we do energy bills. So, I'm oversimplifying a bit here, but unfortunately that's the tendency. And without, going back to the point a couple of my colleagues have made here, without a real technology strategy, without, a better picture of how we're going to actually deal with transport, how we're going to deal with utilities, how we're going to deal with buildings, that's worked out between public and private sectors with, an academic kind of advisory expert advice kind of role as well. We don't have that kind of tripartite thinking process, and we don't have a strategy, and therefore there's no comparison model when Congress goes to write a bill. And I think we need to get there. The technology favoritism that we've got here, would be helped by a certain amount of technology neutrality, because we've got a real technology lock-in problem, right? We've got a 40-year process here, and we are already going down the pathways of attempting to lock in particular technologies driven by the political support systems. And that is not going to work well. So again, having a strategy that's worked out between the sectors, it'll never be perfect. It'll have to be revised all the time. New technologies will enter and enable, significant revision. So it's got to be a living and breathing, ongoing process here. But unless we put that in place, I really fear that we're going to do even more technology lock-in that'll in turn hinder us as we try and get closer to the energy savings goals we need to meet 40 years from now.
Let me open that up to the panel. Because technology lock-in is something that interests me. You don't want to end up with the Betamax of new energy, and there's obviously a real risk if you go too far down on a road with that. So I don't know, maybe Mark, you're at the end of the row, so I'm going to ask you first. But I mean, how do we avoid that? How do we both deploy? Obviously we want to deploy energy, but at the same time avoid getting stuck in the wrong corner and putting political influence and dollars into that. If anyone else wants to jump in after that.
Yeah, I mean, we have an allergy, as Bill is suggesting, to any kind of, strategy. We don't really have an innovation strategy as a nation. So we clearly need, and there's a role, even if it were non-binding, the kind of, I think the road mapping activity that bipartisan is advocated is crucial. Really, there's a fact-free zone in which lobbying just fills the space. So, even the presence of a general authorized federal strategy would be, and that could have plenty of, bottom-up, variation within it. So I think there's huge room for this, and we know that there's simply no agreed-upon fact base in Congress. Mm-hmm. So.
Good.
Bryan, I think this is the $60 trillion question. Is people talk about the difference between industrial policy, which is picking winners, which I think is in the broad sense is probably not what we want to do, and then innovation policy, which could be broadly characterized as getting a bunch of racers to the starting line. And I think that's the delicate balance. There are models for this. Some of the DoD learning that was shared with us today. I mean, the Pentagon will often do 2 or 3 competing within a general space. I mean, if you agree generally that fossil fuels are an issue, and we're probably going to have to deal with them for 50 years, maybe that's controversial, I don't know. But if you think that at some level you're going to have to deal with coal or gas, or just fossil fuel use in industry, then you're going to need something to deal with the carbon. So within that space, you don't necessarily have to pick a single technology. You could, as DoD often does, you say, well, there are 2 or 3 competing platforms. We'll have a bunch of contractors work on each, and we will, we'll kind of winnow them as they go forward, and then we'll sort of see what happens. And ultimately, DoD as the buyer can decide. It might be a little different here because ultimately the private sector power sector will consume. But I don't think this is rocket science to figure out how to do that balance. And yeah, we'll waste money, and there'll be some blind alleys. The Pentagon wasted a lot of money on weapon system development. We just happen to have the best weapons in the world as a result. So I mean, I think that it can't be just 1,000 flowers blooming without any order, but it's also true that you can't pre-select and anoint particular sub-technologies. And I guess, Bill, you've been around this for a long time. I just think that's a constant dance to try to avoid over-specifying.
Oh, by the way, we want to remind audiences to write their questions down, and Jesse and the rest of the people from Breakthrough will come around to pick them up for the Q&A process later. I'm not sure if anyone else wanted to go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point you're making, Armond, which is one of the characteristics that we don't have today in our energy innovation system that I think we really need to think about a way to foster it. It's this idea that we should be able to balance risk and tolerate failure. So, I mean, we should be able to develop a portfolio of activities. Some will succeed and some will fail. And right now there's this real fear that if your project, if you're a program manager at DOE or something, if your project fails, you're going to get dragged to the hill and have to testify as to why this allocation of public dollars didn't work out. And that's just, if you look at it holistically, that is just not the right way to do technology development. That's not what happens in the private sector when they manage innovation programs, and that's not how you're going to actually succeed. I mean, if you're not failing to some degree, you're not trying, and that's really the system we have in place right now.
Yeah, is it possible to get, for the private sector to get that message across, again, to go back to your, the council you're working with? I mean, obviously Bill Gates knows sometimes you have to fail. Microsoft has failed occasionally on the way to where it is now. Is there something in the DNA of government, and again, that resists that? How can that be changed? Well,
how can it be changed? That's a great question. I mean, there's some bright spots. I think the high risk, high reward kind of structure that's been set up around ARPA-E, I think is really encouraging. Whether or not they will be able to maintain their political insulation to actually carry that out is an open question, and they're already getting dragged into budget fights, and it's just year 2 or 3 of that program is not encouraging. But how they actually allocate their dollars still seems to be, from everything I can tell, very much focused on high risk, high reward, and they're going to tolerate some failure, and they have a narrative that allows them to do that. And so creating that culture and creating some protection for some programs where you can take some risk, I think, is something we all need to kind of advocate for, because without that, we're kind of sunk.
Yeah, I would add, I heard someone earlier say something about allowing this distance from a separate entity or something that would be allowed to experiment and do this sort of thing without constant scrutiny from Congress and asking, what are you going to do? Especially now with all this rescue money that's been spent, there's going to be a big drumbeat as to has it done anything. And I think that the problem, I don't know if many of you that have looked at R&D have probably studied this National Academy of Science report, Was It Worth It? The DOE, that evaluated DOE R&D over several years, and it looked at fossil and energy efficiency. And they found that the low E Windows program at DOE carried about 10 other programs in terms of its bang for the buck. And so it was, the strong message that a portfolio is needed. You need to balance the risks amongst many technologies. But I fear that sort of message wouldn't go so far today because people just don't like to hear that. And I think the only way to do it is to create some sort of separate entity or separate focus, or like we hear in some countries, you have a 5-year budget cycle, and after the 5 year you get evaluated. It's not, DOE now, program managers are spending all their time every year reporting on progress and trying to come up with some interim progress measures when they can't sometimes. And that's really difficult for the program managers to be successful.
Bill?
Yeah, I mean, just to add sort of a point on this kind of innovation systems discussion we're having, we actually have made a fair amount of progress in the way in which we're organizing the innovation system in energy in the last few years. I mean, we actually have come a substantial distance, right? So when we started out a few years ago, we had an historically problematic stovepipe system with, your classic Vannevar Bush basic research agency that, that funded labs and university research and had its own constituency and its own undersecretary, and then there was another undersecretary that had applied R&D and that funded industry, and almost nothing moved between those stovepipes at DOE. Very little technology transfer between the two sides, and we have made progress here through a series of mechanisms. One, the Energy Frontier Research Centers have put a real focus on energy technologies within that basic science portfolio, within the Office of Science at DOE, a very important step. The last administration worked on putting that in place and did it well. The next stage up, which is, hey, you've got some promising opportunities, let's start to think about how you scale up the research that you're going to need to get focused to kind of move closer towards the marketplace. Well, we've got the beginnings of some interesting hub proposals, which some of the folks on this panel have played a real role on. And then we've got this very interesting ARPA-E thing. very promising, very different model, right? They're only operating in kind of territories that have gotten missed, right? They're looking at this, what Arun Majumdar earlier told you was a kind of white space, and that's pretty intriguing and potentially builds a bridge between the historic stovepipes of the basic research side and the applied side, taking ideas that have basic promise and then accelerating them in a 3 or 4 year period, the life of a program manager at RPE, and then moving them to a handoff on the applied side. And the relationships between ERE and RPE are quite good. And then, as you all heard earlier, DOE took the technology up to that prototype moment and then has always had difficulty with the demonstration moment, right? So you got to this kind of wall of the end of DOE's role, and then kind of nothing really happened, right? But you heard the panel earlier where DOE and DOD folks, I think one of them said, I guess the moderator asked if there was they had any questions for each other, and they said, well, no, because we talk to each other all the time. Well, that's revolutionary, right? I mean, that's never happened before. And, the role that DOD could play in taking that next step, doing the test beds, right? In an area like building technologies, that's crucial, right? The private sector is not going to supply those test beds. The industry isn't organized to do that. So DOD playing a role in something they've historically done well, the test bed side, and DOD playing a role in initial markets, something that they're pretty used to. That's a very interesting chain where you can start seeing some increasing productivity in the whole system. So there's a lot, as you all have reminded us, that needs to be done, but we're actually making some progress, at least on the innovation system side.
Yeah. Good. Bryan, can I just add, I think to Bill's point, I think there's also been a lot of good thinking, including Bill's book, on how do you go the next stage to commercial scale deployment. And there are all kinds of ideas about RFPs for first-of-kind technology that DoD or others might put out. But I think the menu is being filled out. But I do want to make a larger point on this kind of the political doability question. I was struck, hearing the talks this morning about the history of American, government setting the stage for innovation, and how much of that story we've forgotten and is simply marginal to the political discussion right now, and frankly in both parties. I think that the sort of the market paradigm has taken over to the point where it's almost, you have to almost apologize to talk about a government role. And I think it may take, I think it may take 10 years for us to do this, but I think the work of people in this room who care about this issue is to recenter this discourse on some history and some actual appreciation of why we have the economy we have, as opposed to thinking it was created by Wall Street, financial engineering, that there was actually, there was actually knowledge, there was social knowledge and investments in knowledge and deployment and scale up that the government was the guarantor of. And I think until we change that, frankly, we're going to be fighting over nickels. And I don't know how to do that. I think this conference is a start. I think anyone in Bill's book and others, are like beginning to get that message out there. But I'm still looking for the political leader, frankly, in either party who kind of gets this vision and is willing to defend it without apology. And it may not be the first election cycle where you win, but God, if there's a moment of broken idols where you can actually say, well, maybe what we have been doing isn't working for the economy, not just for energy, but for all aspects of the economy, this is it.
Maybe that no labels party can seize on this issue.
Yeah.
But I don't want to step on the heels too much of the coming panel, which I think is a lot about politics. But do we have a long-term thinking problem here? I mean, have we lost the ability to actually think over the long term, to wait for the long-term benefits you need for energy innovation? I mean, as a political system.
One thing I just throw in, I mean, it seems like, though, at the same time, short to medium term deployment and commercialization seems, top of the next area for completing the kind of portfolio of interesting, institutional innovation that Bill's talking about, and Armond as well. Clearly some kind of deployment authority, or some kind of bank making available some kind of low cost capital, and some kind of de-risking piece that I think we heard about this morning, just before this. I mean, some kind of backstopping or even, efficacy insurance to take the technology risk, just trying to push this, set of new ideas, that are functional. I think it's important to remember that, but and embedding innovation in this broader commercialization discussion. I think we've been overly enamored with the R&D breakthrough heroic moment, and we need to embed it back in this sweep of historic incremental learning by doing that we've been good at as a nation.
Well, that's one thing. I think we're going to go soon to audience Q&A, but Bill, one question on this. I mean, where there is this romance of the breakthrough moment, of the next technology, the silver bullet that will solve this, but at the same time, how much do we need to get technologies out there, get them in the marketplace, get them on the ground, put the megawatts on the ground, but at the same time, how do we avoid, again, to go back to the lock-in question, avoid not getting stuck with the technology that ends up not working, spending a lot of money, and then creating perhaps an industry that ends up having political influence of its own that then disrupts this process even further?
Yeah, look, this probably is not the toughest set of technology problems the country has ever faced, and we can start seeing the strands that we're going to get to. But this is for sure the toughest technology implementation problem the country has ever had to deal with. And we would never try to do a technology implementation over a 40-year period, transforming a huge established sector of the economy. We just don't do that stuff, right? And we're going to have to learn how to do it. What's the balance between the breakthrough side and the incremental advance side? I don't think we have any option here. We've got to do both of those things, right? And I think everybody here would probably agree with that. I think RPE has taught me some interesting lessons about what some very interesting white space ideas might be, and if they succeed on 1 out of 20 of what they do, right, and they're prepared to take risks, things gets interesting in a couple of sectors here. So that's well worth, I would argue, pursuing, because who knows what those technology opportunities might be. But secondly, breakthrough technologies take a long time to bring into the system. You're talking about, a 20-year process, probably at a minimum, as you learn how to scale up and drive down the cost curve and then increase production. These are lengthy periods of time, so we're going to have to, we can kind of see what the strands are probably, right, which is an important step. And we've got to start, bringing into focus a strategy and a set of pictures around how we're going to make the incremental advances that will get there. So it's not either or. We're going to have to really sharpen our capabilities on both fronts. And a lot of that incremental advance is what I was referring to before. A breakthrough technology that looks like the Wright brothers' first aircraft is not the same thing, as a 787. We're going to have to think about an R&D program that gives us not just the Wright brothers moment, but gets us down the cost curve and the incremental advance curve to get to really major advances in cost cutting and technology too. So we're going to have to do a panoply of things in a coordinated kind of way, and it's going to be really hard, but it will be very interesting. We can pull it off, and if we pull it off in energy, you can start thinking about ways that model could apply to other complex established sectors that we don't bother to deal with, right? Healthcare delivery, right? Areas that we've left immune to innovation, that we could start building models for in energy that might be interesting in other territories.
Okay, one other thing here. Will we be doing this? I mean, I know we talk about not using climate change as the only reason for doing this, but would we be embarking on this if we weren't worried about climate change? On this attempt to speed this process up? I mean, Armond, what do you think?
Probably not.
No.
I mean, I think, I like to think that people care about the international oil flows, but again, it's
not worked for 40 years.
Well, it's a problem of political tension and stamina. And I think it's, when the oil price is high, people get kind of upset. It's not to say that's not a really good reason to do it, but and I think the pessimists in this room would say we won't do this either, because at the end of the day, climate is too distant a concern for most people, and it has low salience. It has high popularity but low salience. We're all working to change that. But I would have to say that at this point, let's find our allies where we can. But I think the third piece I think that may have more resonance is the unlabeled party that may actually want to see growth in this country at some point in the future, real growth as opposed to financial engineering. And this is a pretty good place to start. on that basis alone. And again, it's not politically popular. It won't get you a nice editorial in the Wall Street Journal if you proposed a program like this. But I think maybe it's neither climate nor national security alone. Maybe it has to be led by this moment I think a lot of us are having, and a lot of people who are worried about the future of the economy, which is what's the next big thing that actually gets us back in a growth mode and not in managed decline.
Sasha, maybe you can get Bloomberg on the AEIC and get him involved with this, since he's doing that, obviously. But you, yeah, we had the first audience questions that is for you, actually. It's from Peter Teague. U.S. philanthropy put hundreds of millions of dollars into cap and trade, but there's been very little dollars in the system so far to advance the innovation agenda. Well, this is it. Will Bill Gates and the CEOs put money behind those public statements on energy innovation?
Well, that's a good question. We're working hard to see if they will. I mean, but you know, one thing I'd just like to maybe, in response to that, I think that it'd be useful to kind of highlight it. I think a little confusion on how cap and trade, you know, it gets sort of cast as an alternative to innovation, and I think, you know, we should, you know, at least my view is we should see innovation as an end, and cap and trade or and other policies as a mechanism to get to what we all want, which is technology innovation, and you know, new technologies invented and deployed in the marketplace. And cap and trade is one way of helping to create the right incentives and developing a market for these low carbon technologies. And it's an important mechanism in its own right, but it's not an alternative to doing innovation policy, I think. I mean, you need to invest in research and development, but that's not innovation policy either. You know, there are a couple of key ingredients, I think, that we should keep in mind when we think about innovation policy, and it's, you know, markets for the technologies that are going to be developed, and it could be things like prices on CO2 and caps, portfolio standards, you know, requirements that people actually put these technologies into use. It's investing in technologies and R&D, and it's creating a supportive network and system of public policies that drive us in that direction. And so, I mean, that's just my little soapbox on innovation and cap and trade. Will these guys actually step up and start to support more public policy work in this space? I'm confident that the answer will be yes, although I can't speak on their behalf.
One thing about that, I mean, Kathy Zoe at the Department of Energy had said in an earlier panel that she sort of tells her people, you can get a technology down to about 120, 130% above, or you know, of the price of the competition. She can work the policy levers to get down there. I mean, is that, when we talk about the pull factors we need, does that seem like it's a fair number to you? I mean, do you think, you know, would that provide enough of a pull, or is that to actually meet the technology need, something like that? And anyone can grab that one.
I think that's the right spitting distance from the existing system, and I think we're not there on a lot of the technologies. So it's a fair challenge. Again, I think we saw things like, you know, I look at examples like NOx controls or sulfur controls. You put those together, and it, you know, sort of somewhere in that sort of 20% over the current baseline kind of thing. So there's some reason to want to do demand pull for sure. Bryan, I wanted to go back to another point about the philanthropy and just say, observation is, there's a lot of money sitting on the sidelines right now that I'd call it quasi-philanthropic, quasi-investment. There are a lot of people sitting on a lot of money as a result of the last decade of growth that now seems to be ending, that want to play in this space. And they're thinking about some of these investments. But I mean, you see Gates take a position in advanced nuclear power or air capture, and it's an interesting moment because this private capital may just be looking for the kind of little risk guarantees, and that Mark's describing. It may not be a lot of bucks. It may actually be some quite surgical things the government could do to patch things over. But I think that 20% bogey is a pretty good rule of thumb.
Mm-hmm. It's a question for Bill from Paul Moen of Amgen. He says that biotech has been the biggest money-losing business based on success rates, but we hold it up as a great success since it did introduce new functionalities to an established pharma market. Government payers saw biotech medicine as high value versus high cost. Are there lessons here for energy innovation?
Yeah, I mean, for sure there are lessons here, and biotech, is an example of the federal government playing an innovation role, particularly in the R&D side in that case, that did result in a raft of, very significant advances. And I guess I would argue that, there's going to be a lot more, right? We're seeing a whole new model of the convergence of life sciences, physical sciences, engineering sciences coming together that I think is going to bring a whole second wind to that biotech sector as these historically disparate disciplines start to combine and create a new generation of therapies and devices. So, the model worked here. It is another example of new functionality commanding premium prices, and frankly, the cost of bringing new biotech drugs to market is enormous, in part because of the very complex regulatory structure that we have for health and safety reasons. So it gives us a lesson about the importance of new functionality that we ought to remember and keep in mind as we think about energy technologies. So if there are, again, I think second generation of energy technologies are going to be a fair amount of new functionality, but can we build some of those into the first generation as we assemble our R&D portfolios? Because it's a lesson about consumers being willing to pay a premium in order to get a hold of an advance.
Next question for you, Mark. It's from Daniel Goldfarb at the Americans for Energy Leadership. Green jobs were sold to the American public in the 2008 campaign. They've proven, so far at least, mostly illusory, weakening the arguments for investing in a green economy. How do we provide a more realistic vision of clean energy jobs in America, especially as those that pertain to clusters? And does this vision hold the appeal of green construction, green-collar manufacturing workers?
Yeah. Well, interestingly, later, by the middle of next year, we'll bring out at Brookings a major cross-sectional study of what exactly what we call the clean energy economy is in metropolitan areas and states, and it will help along with the other work that's been done to somewhat reframe this away from green jobs, which I think collapsed into kind of energy efficiency, neighborhood insulator jobs. And will show a very wide band of occupations, significant growth rates in a number of areas. No, this is not a huge economy yet, although we take a quite narrow definition and are going to pick up significant growth through the recession. So, I think this is a broad economy. It's potentially a large economy as it ripples through all sorts of established industries. And it's a diverse one that, interestingly, rural places are going to look very good in certain areas. So we see this as a potential, bridging point where you could have many places, many red state places, many rural places seeing themselves in an emerging new economy if it's described, defined, and framed a little differently.
Just to add a thought on top of that, it's not. In some ways, we phrased this with the wrong question. Where are the immediate green jobs? Where are the immediate short-term job creation? The clean energy economy that Mark is referencing, is potentially a global innovation wave, right? And global innovation waves are unbelievably powerful and transformative. And we look at what the IT innovation wave did in the United States, in the 80s and 90s, right? The 90s were one of the most successful economic decades in this country's history, and in terms of overall return and well-being to our population. And we grew our GDP at a rate that nobody in the world could believe during that time period. We moved from, we were heading towards some kind of rough parity with Japan and Germany. If you'd ask economists in 1985, there was a fair amount of betting going on that the U.S. might be third, it might be tied for first with two other players. That's not what happened. We brought on an IT innovation wave, and the U.S. grew its economy, from like the 3 trillion range to the, 25 years later to the 13 trillion range, right? And frankly, Japan and Germany missed that wave. The consequences of missing a big innovation wave in one of these great global sectors are really powerful. And this is probably going to be one. For sure, a lot of Asian countries are betting on this, and a lot of European countries are betting on this. We haven't even begun to put our bets on the table yet. But the U.S. has a history of leading virtually every major innovation wave in the 20th century, from aviation to space to power to IT to biotech to computing. We led all of these with profound benefits throughout the economy. If you miss a big innovation wave, you start to look much more like Japan missing the height of the IT wave, right? And that's not a great position to be in for a country that's ambitious and energetic like ours. So I think we were talking about political drivers earlier, and Mark and some others made the point that this is a powerful one. I think it is a powerful one, but it's not going to be short-term insulating jobs. It means starting a wedge in the economy where some public investment is going to start driving private investment, and you create a virtuous cycle of investment. It's going to take time to build up, but somehow we're going to explain the option here to the American people in a better way than we've done so far.
Let me just add one thing I didn't quite say. This is not a single economy. What is fascinating about it, for someone interested in American industrial transformation, there's a myriad different configurations. Albuquerque's positioning is formidable in certain areas. The Front Range has consortia, interesting range, emergent clusters. Every place, many places are going to be players and are beginning to see themselves, transforming the U.S. economy. And this is the bottom-up kind of diversity that we can celebrate by making these and drive, making these crucial federal adjustments.
One last question. We've talked a lot, and I do this as well. We talk a lot about as if the population is going to be, the general population is going to be the ones who actually adopt these emerging technologies for energy, but it's actually, when it comes to electricity, of course, it's going to be utilities who will actually be the ones who will be the customers. Not always the most innovative, forward-thinking customers out there. So how are there public policy options, levers that can be available to get utilities to play their role in trying to become adopters for this? And this one's for anyone who wants to sort of get the last word.
I'll start because I want to just pick up one thing that I think is absolutely critical, and it doesn't really get the legs it should, which is this decoupling of utility profits from sales. So give them the incentive to invest in aggressively in energy efficiency and smart grids and these sorts of things, rather than saying you sold less power, you get less profits. And so there's been some experimentation there. There's been a lot of discussions with utility regulators. There's been dockets filed, and I know there's been fits and starts here and there, but if you really wanted to do this, especially in energy efficiency, that's a critical one policy you can do.
I think on the electricity side, particularly the central station stuff as opposed to the energy distributed efficiency, the policies are obvious. You either have a rate commission that allows or encourages innovative technology. A good example of that is Indiana, the state of Indiana, which authorized an inexpensive, first-of-kind integrated gasification combined cycle plant, which hopefully will be coupled with carbon capture and storage. Given the recent troubles that Duke has had before that commission, it's not clear we'll ever get to that stage. But that was an example of a governor saying, I do have to make a long bet on this. Coal is going to be part of our state's future. I am going to authorize, put the state's guarantee, as it were, behind this. So the rate setting process, the state level utility regulation, is a remarkable source of capital, because there's $270 billion a year sloshing around that system. And so I would think we'd look there. The other ideas that are floating around are things like federal procurement of first of kind that gets things technology ready. But it's going to have to reduce the risk for utilities. Utilities are not going to go out and make entrepreneurial bets. That's the one thing we know about utilities.
Right. Well, I think we clearly know that we have a lot of options out there. We know some of the path forward, and we know some of the amount of money we have to spend But it seems to me the real challenge is going to be politically getting the force behind actually doing that, especially in the current atmosphere. But that's good because we have a panel that will talk about that at the end of the day. So thank you to my panel, and thank you for your attention.